Years ago, I worked on a construction site. Back then, the night shift felt like an endless torment, a parade of shadows playing tricks on my nerves. But at the end of the day, it was just a job like any other. I had to put food on the table. However, what I witnessed on that site would change my life forever, leaving an invisible scar that would never heal. The construction was on the outskirts of the city, a massive concrete structure rising like a sleeping beast. From the very beginning, the site had a heavy atmosphere, as if the ground itself rejected what we were building on it. The workers spoke in hushed tones, exchanging whispers and wary glances. I remember clearly when one of them, an old man named Gus, muttered under his breath that the place was cursed. The rumor spread quickly. They said that to ensure the success of the construction, offerings had to be made. At first, I thought it was just superstition. I had heard of rituals and sacrifices in construction projects before, but I never gave it much thought. That is, until I saw it with my own eyes. One night I arrived for my shift earlier than usual. The site was eerily silent, as if every worker had suddenly vanished. I walked among the columns and beams looking for someone, anyone, but all I found were abandoned tools and open bags of cement, as if their owners had dropped them and fled in terror. When I reached Block 9, an unfinished section of the site, I saw movement in the distance. I approached cautiously, my instincts screaming that something was very wrong. There, the foreman and a group of workers stood in a tight circle around someone. A cold sweat ran down my back when I realized that someone was a homeless man, an older man with grey, unkempt hair and tattered clothes. He looked unconscious, or maybe just resigned to his fate. I watched in silence as they dragged him toward a hollowed-out section of the concrete wall, a space that had been deliberately left open. Some of the workers whispered, avoiding eye contact, as if looking directly at the man would bring a curse upon them. The foreman gave a signal, and one of the workers began covering the homeless man with cement. His hands trembled as he poured the fresh mixture, slowly at first, hesitating, but then faster, trying to finish the job as quickly as possible. The man made no sound. Maybe he was too broken, too defeated to resist. When the cement covered his face, I couldn't take it anymore. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps of panic and disgust. I stood there, pressed against the wall, watching as they completed the job. Only when the last brick sealed the opening did the site fall into an eerie silence. None of the workers said a word. They simply dispersed like shadows. That night, I went home not knowing if what I had seen was real or a nightmare. Deep down, I knew the answer. I wanted to report it, to tell someone, but fear consumed me from the inside out. Who would believe me? Besides, the foreman had power. Any attempt to speak out could cost me my job, or worse, my life. The following week became a parade of unsettling events. The wind howled through the unfinished structures, carrying with it eerie, muffled groans. Whispers of sorrow seemed to seep from Block 9. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the weight of guilt playing tricks on me, but soon I realized I wasn't the only one hearing them. Other workers noticed too. No one dared to talk about it, but I could see the fear in their eyes every time they passed by that section of the site. One day, Gus, the old man who had first spoken of the curse, approached me. His voice was barely above a whisper as he muttered, "Something I will never forget. The offerings will multiply. This won't be the last, kid, not the last." At first, I didn't understand what he meant, but soon the truth hit me like a sledgehammer. Every time the project faced delays, another offering would vanish from the streets. The authorities never investigated too deeply, just another missing homeless person, cases that barely made the news. Meanwhile, the construction pressed forward, as if each sacrifice fueled its progress. It felt as if the very concrete was feeding on their souls. Some nights the cries were louder. It was as if those buried within the walls were still there, trapped, struggling to break free from their cement prison. Some workers claimed to see shadows moving through Block 9, human-like figures appearing and disappearing between the beams, lost souls caught in an endless cycle of suffering. Avoided that part of the site as much as possible, but fate had other plans. One stormy night I was assigned to do a security inspection. The rain poured relentlessly, making the half-built structure loom even more ominously in the dark. As I walked past Block 9, I felt it. An overwhelming sensation of being watched. Then the sound came, a dull, rhythmic knocking. From inside the wall, the air left my lungs. It was faint at first, but then it grew more desperate. Someone was trapped inside. Someone was trying to get out. Panic took hold of me. I wanted to run, but my feet felt cemented to the ground. That's when I saw it, a crack in the wall. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest, and then I saw the face, or what was left of it. Embedded in the concrete, a man's face stared back at me, frozen in eternal terror. Though his eyes were lifeless, they seemed to follow me, to accuse me. I ran. I left that city. I moved far away, hoping to escape the memories of that night. But the screams, the faces, the empty, accusing eyes, they still haunt me. Every time I close mine, in the dead of night, when the silence is heavy and the darkness feels suffocating, I hear them. The building was completed. It now stands tall, a monument of horror, a mausoleum of forgotten souls. Whenever I hear about disappearances, unsolved cases, I can't help but wonder, how many more offerings are still being made? How many more bodies are being swallowed by the walls of other buildings, in other cities, in other forgotten Block 9s? Because in the end, that structure isn't just made of concrete and steel. It's built on bones, on trapped souls, on an agony that time will never erase. Years ago, I worked on a construction site. Back then, the night shift felt like an endless torment, a parade of shadows playing tricks on my nerves. But in the end, it was just a job like any other. I had to put food on the table. However, what I witnessed on that site would change my life forever, leaving me with an invisible scar that would never heal. The site was located on the outskirts of the city, a massive concrete structure rising like a sleeping beast. From the start, the place had a heavy atmosphere, as if the land itself rejected what we were building. The workers spoke in hushed tones, exchanging whispers and uneasy glances. I remember one of them, an old man named Henry, muttering under his breath that the place was cursed. The rumor spread quickly. Some said that to ensure the success of the construction, sacrifices had to be made. At first, I thought it was just the usual superstitions. I had heard stories about rituals and sacrifices at construction sites before, but I never paid them much attention, not until I saw it with my own eyes. One night, I arrived for my shift a little earlier than usual. The site was eerily silent, as if all the workers had suddenly disappeared. I walked among the columns and beams, searching for someone, anyone, but all I found were abandoned tools and bags of cement left open, as if their owners had dropped them. and fled in terror. When I reached Sector 9, a part of the building we had yet to finish, I saw movement in the distance. My instincts told me something was wrong, so I approached cautiously. There in the dim light stood the foreman and a group of workers surrounding someone. A cold sweat ran down my back when I realized that someone was a homeless man, an old man with graying hair and tattered clothes, seemingly unconscious, or completely resigned to his fate. I watched in silence as they dragged him toward an opening in the concrete wall, a gap that had been deliberately left there. Some of the men whispered among themselves, avoiding eye contact with the victim, as if looking directly at him would bring a curse upon them. The foreman gave a signal, and one of the workers began pouring wet cement over the man. His hands trembled as he hesitated at first, but then he increased his pace, eager to finish the job as quickly as possible. The man made no sound. Perhaps he was too defeated, too broken to care anymore. When the cement covered his face, I couldn't take it any longer. I stepped back, my breath coming in panicked gasps. I stood there, pressed against the wall, watching as they finished sealing the opening. The place fell into a deathly silence. None of the workers spoke. They simply dispersed like shadows. That night, I went home without knowing if what I had witnessed was real or just a nightmare. But my heart knew the answer. I wanted to report it, to tell someone, but fear consumed me from the inside out. Who would believe me? Besides, the foreman had influence. Any attempt to report them would put my job and my life at risk. So, like everyone else, I stayed silent, but the real horror was only beginning. Days passed, and I tried to bury that night deep in my mind. But the sight had changed. Something invisible yet undeniable had taken root in the unfinished structure. At first, it was the whispers, faint murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Whenever I walked past the sealed section, I felt something watching me, unseen eyes pressing against my back. Other workers reported strange occurrences, tools disappearing, lights flickering, sudden chills that made their skin crawl. Then came the shadows. Figures darting between pillars, just outside the reach of our flashlights. One worker, James, swore he saw a man standing at the top floor in the dead of night, even though no one was supposed to be up there. When he called out, the figure simply stepped backward, right off the edge. But when James rushed to check, there was nothing, no body, no trace of anyone. The fear spread like wildfire. Some workers quit on the spot, refusing to set foot in that cursed place again. Others, like me, stayed out of necessity, but every day the site felt less like a workplace and more like a mausoleum. One night, I was assigned to inspect the upper levels alone. I climbed the unfinished stairwell, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. When I reached the top, I heard it, faint at first, but growing clearer with each step. "Don't leave me here." My blood turned to ice. The voice was weak, almost pleading. It came from inside the walls. I turned to run, but then I saw him, the old man. His face was pale, his sunken eyes locked onto mine. He stood motionless, half hidden in the shadows, just a few feet away. Then he moved. Not like a person. There was no weight to his steps, no sound. He drifted toward me, his lips moving, whispering those same words over and over. "Don't leave me here. Don't leave me here." I bolted. Down the stairs, through the corridors, past the sealed wall where his body had been entombed. My own breath was a ragged mess, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was outside, where the cold night air finally reminded me that I was still alive. I never went back. The next morning, I quit. Whatever was buried in that building wasn't meant to be disturbed. But I knew that it wasn't over. Years later, I passed by the finished structure. It stood tall, pristine, a modern marvel. But as I looked up at the top floor, I felt it again. That suffocating presence, those unseen eyes. Some nights, even now, I wake up gasping for air, my room filled with an oppressive silence, and in the darkness I swear I hear him. Don't leave me here. I don't know if I'll ever be free of him. Maybe no one will, because some things, some sins, can't be buried. They linger, waiting, watching, and wonder. My name is Edward, and I'm from Houston. I've worked in construction since I was 18, and I've seen things most people wouldn't believe. But none of those experiences compare to what we went through on a site just outside the city. A memory burned into my mind like a dark and persistent tattoo. Even today, it haunts me on the quietest nights, when the silence is so heavy it feels like even the air is afraid to move. It was an ordinary afternoon when it happened. We were digging the foundations for a new building, a big project that would keep us busy for at least a year. The sun was out, but the heat didn't reach the trenches where we worked. Instead, a damp chill clung to the ground, the kind that seeps into your bones like a constant shiver. The shovels and pickaxes moved steadily, breaking through the hardened soil that had been abandoned for years. Everything seemed normal until my co-worker Raymond struck something with his pickaxe. It got stuck. He bent down and started clearing the dirt with his hands. That's when I saw what he had already discovered: a bone. At first, I thought it belonged to an animal, but as I examined it more closely, I recognized the shape. It wasn't long or curved like a dog's bone, the kind you might find buried in an empty lot. It was human. The shape, the size, we knew immediately. As we removed more dirt, more bones began to appear. They were scattered, as if someone had thrown them there without care, or maybe they had been moved and buried in this place at some unknown point in time. The pile grew, and with each new bone we uncovered, the air around us seemed to thicken, becoming heavy and difficult to breathe. No one wanted to say anything, but we all knew what was running through each other's minds. What did this mean? Who did these remains belong to? And why were they here? Our instincts told us to stop and report it to the authorities. But our foreman, a skeptical man who hated complications, told us to keep working. It's better not to get involved in unnecessary problems, he said. We decided to keep digging and covered the bones back up with the same dirt we had pulled them from. Maybe it was an act of cowardice, but none of us wanted to risk losing our jobs. That same night, just as we finished covering the area, a dog appeared at the site. It was black as the night, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb what little light was left. The first thing that caught my attention was its eyes, deep red, glowing with an unnatural intensity. It stood there, staring at us, studying us as if it knew exactly what we had done. I felt its gaze pierce through me, an overwhelming sensation that made me instinctively step back. The dog remained still, watching. None of us dared to approach it. There was something about it that inspired an irrational fear, a terror that made you want to run, yet froze you in place at the same time. There wasn't much we could do, so we all just went home. But my thoughts kept returning to the dog, to those red eyes that seemed to have left a mark inside me. The next day, the dog was still there. This time, it was lying down, right on top of the spot where we had found the bones. The strange thing was, it didn't bark or growl. It just watched. Every time someone tried to get close, the dog would slowly rise and move with an unsettling calm, as if it knew we wouldn't be able to scare it away easily. No one talked about it, but it was obvious that its presence disturbed us. Days passed, and the dog remained in the same place. Something about its behavior started to unnerve the workers. Raymond, the one who first found the bones, was the first to crack. He told me he had dreamed of the dog, and in his dream the animal chased him through an abandoned cemetery. A place so dark and desolate that even the stars refused to shine above it. He woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, with the sensation that something was right behind him, though he was alone in his room. I too began to have strange dreams. I dreamed of walking through the construction site, but instead of an empty lot, it had turned into an ancient cemetery. The graves were broken, crosses and headstones scattered as if someone had destroyed everything. I walked through the ruins, and at the end of the path, the dog was always there, staring at me with those glowing red eyes. Meanwhile, at the construction site, things started going wrong. Tools went missing, and the workers who tried to continue in the area where we found the bones suffered accidents. One of the guys, Michael, fell from a structure and broke his leg. It wasn't fatal, but we all knew there was something more behind it. It was as if the ground itself was cursed, like something unseen but powerful was trying to protect it from our intrusion. Then the rumors began. Some said the dog was the guardian of a forgotten cemetery, an ancient resting place that had been disturbed when we started digging. Others claimed it wasn't a dog at all, but the spirit of someone buried there, seeking revenge. And then there was the darkest theory, the one that whispered the dog wasn't an animal nor a spirit, but the devil himself, sent to punish those who had desecrated the peace of the dead. Weeks passed, and the dog remained there, still, watching. Most of the crew was on the verge of paranoia, and some even refused to continue working. I tried to stay calm, not to give in to irrational fear, but every night the dreams grew stronger, more vivid, as if something was calling to me, whispering my name from deep within the earth. One day, the foreman decided we had to dig in the same spot again to move forward with the project. No one wanted to, but we had no choice. The moment our shovels touched the ground, the dog began to howl. It wasn't a normal howl. It was a wail, a cry so haunting it seemed to come from beyond this world. It sent a shiver down our spines, and despite the foreman's attempts to assert his authority, no one dared to lift another shovel. The dog stayed there, howling, its glowing eyes fixed on us like burning embers in the darkness. Finally, the foreman gave up. He ordered the area to be fenced off, as if that would be enough to contain whatever was beneath the soil. That night, the dog disappeared. We never saw it again. Yet, the feeling of being watched never left. The nights were worse. I could feel something lurking at the edge of the site, something dark and nameless that had marked us forever. Shortly after, the project was cancelled. No official reason was given, but we all knew. The legend of the black dog had spread. People avoided walking near the site, and those who did said they felt the air grow heavier, the atmosphere oppressive, as if something unseen was pushing them away. I never heard about that dog again, nor what happened to that place. But every time I dream of it, I wake up with the overwhelming sensation that something terrible is still there, waiting. And on nights when the silence becomes unbearable, I wonder if that dog was more than just a warning. Maybe there are places we are not meant to disturb, secrets that must remain buried, and guardians that never rest, even in eternity. Since that day, I never look at a construction site without wondering what might be hidden beneath my feet. Maybe somewhere another worker is unknowingly digging their way into madness, awakening something that should have remained undisturbed. And maybe, just like me, they will one day realize some things in this world are meant to stay forgotten, even if time and human curiosity insist. I was a night watchman. I'm 46 years old, and I left the construction industry after this experience. Years have passed, but I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the sound of muffled crying echoing in my ears. It happened at a project that was never completed in downtown Chicago. It was an abandoned construction site, a skeletal structure that had suddenly stopped with no clear explanation. No one talked much about it. They just said there had been problems with permits and funding, and that maybe one day the work would resume. That day never came, and after what I saw, I hope it never does. It all started on a winter night. The site was pitch dark, and the wind howled through the scaffolding, making the wooden planks creak like a mournful whisper. That night, I was assigned to guard duty alone, something I had done before without issue. My job was simple: watch over the tools and ensure no one sneaked in to steal anything. It was the kind of work I could do almost on autopilot. But that night, something was different, something I couldn't ignore. There were rumors among the workers, whispers about shadows moving near the foundation after dark. Some even swore they had heard voices. I always thought it was just stories meant to scare the rookies, to make us believe the site was haunted. I laughed at those tales until I experienced something I never thought possible. It was almost 2 a.m. when I saw her for the first time. I was checking that the tools were in place when I noticed something in my peripheral vision, a white figure moving near the foundation. I stepped closer, thinking it was some homeless person or maybe someone who had sneaked in to steal. But as I approached, the figure took shape. It was a woman, and not just any woman. She wore a tattered white dress, stained with dirt, and something darker that in the dim light looked like blood. She was crying. Her sobs were soft, almost a whisper, but loud enough for me to hear over the wind. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I could feel her sorrow, her pain, like a sharp sting in my chest. This wasn't ordinary crying. It was as if each tear she shed carried centuries of suffering. I took a few cautious steps toward her, but the closer I got, the further she moved away. I tried to calm her, speaking words I don't even remember, but she didn't respond. She just kept retreating, always maintaining the same distance between us. At times, she seemed to fade into the shadows, and I would stop, thinking maybe I had imagined it all, until the crying began again, and I saw her once more, always near the foundation, always weeping. The cold grew more intense, cutting through me like a blade, seeping into my bones. Then suddenly a stronger gust of wind made a nearby scaffold shake violently. I jumped back, fearing the structure would collapse on me, but it stopped. And then I noticed she was gone. The silence was suffocating, as if the world itself had held its breath. I looked around, searching for any trace of her, but there was nothing, just darkness. I went back to my post and tried to calm myself. It's just exhaustion, I told myself. Just exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. I wanted to forget it, but something told me this wouldn't be the last time I saw her. The next night, I wasn't as confident. Every shadow looked like her. silhouette, every creak like her sobs. But this time, something was different. As the hours passed, I noticed marks on the ground near the foundation. They were small, deep footprints, forming a trail leading into the darkness. I followed the marks, flashlight shaking in my hand, my steps echoing on the cold, bare concrete. At the end of the trail, I saw her again. This time, she was standing still, watching me. Now I could see her face more clearly. Her eyes were empty, black voids, lifeless, yet filled with something that wasn't human. Her skin was pale and corpse-like, stretched unnaturally over her bones. But the most terrifying part, she had no lips. Her mouth was just a dark slit, a wound that opened and closed without making a sound. Yet from her throat came that same relentless sobbing, a torment that had lodged itself in my mind. I tried to step back, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground, paralyzed by sheer terror. And then she raised a hand. I could do nothing but watch as she moved toward me. I don't know how long it lasted, but at some point I felt a pull in my chest, like an invisible hand reaching inside me, trying to rip something away. And then, nothing. I was alone, standing in the dark. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. The next morning, I tried to talk to the other workers about what I had seen. They looked at me strangely, as if I were insane. No one wanted to hear my story. No one wanted to talk about the woman. In fact, most refused to go near the site after dark. Everyone knew something was wrong, but they pretended it wasn't, like ignoring it would make it go away. Several nights passed without incident, and though I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination, I couldn't erase her image from my mind. The last night I spent there, I decided it would be my final watch. There was something in the air, a tension that made every second stretch unbearably. That night, the sobbing began earlier, long before usual. I froze. That sound, the one I had learned to hate. I saw her coming closer, gliding through the shadows like a hungry ghost. This time she didn't retreat. She stopped right in front of me and reached out her hand. Her touch was ice, painfully cold. I felt my strength drain away, like every second near her was pulling the life out of me. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to return. I knew the construction would never be completed. That site was cursed, a place where something terrible had happened. And somehow, that woman was trapped there, condemned to wander through those unfinished foundations for eternity. Rumors spread among the workers, and little by little everyone abandoned the site. I don't know what became of that building, or if anyone ever tried to restart the project. All I know is that since that night, every time I pass by that place, I feel that same piercing cold. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I hear the echo of her sobs. That's why I left construction work. No one will ever understand what I saw, what I felt, but I know it was real. No one can tell me it was just a dream or a hallucination. That night in Chicago, standing before that unfinished skeleton of a building, I faced something that did not belong to this world, and it left a mark on me forever. No one would dare build on that land, and I hope they never do. Because some things are better left undisturbed. Some secrets are better left buried. It was the year 2016. We were about to finish the construction of a skyscraper in New York City, an imposing structure that towered over the chaos and noise of the city. I remember every detail of that project, every bolt, every beam, and every endless day of work under the relentless sun. But what I will never forget is what happened in the final days of that job. Something that still wakes me up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat with my heart pounding. One of the crane operators, a man hardened by years of tough labor, started talking about something strange. He said he had seen a little girl from up high. At first, we all took it as a joke, just a passing comment. But he insisted. He claimed that every afternoon around 5 p.m. he saw her standing on the top floor of the building, right on the edge, staring at the sky, then down at the void below. We all knew that this project had its setbacks. Every construction site does. But no one had ever mentioned anything as grim as a death. However, rumors started to spread. Some said she was the spirit of a girl who had fallen during an earlier phase of construction when the building was still just a steel skeleton. I didn't believe in those things, at least not then. But after what I experienced, I'm not so sure anymore. One afternoon, as the heat began to fade and the sky turned that deep orange color that only New York sunsets can create, I decided to stay late to check on some details on the upper floors. The workers had all gone home, and the only sound left was the slow, rhythmic movement of the crane. I walked up to the top floor at a leisurely pace, knowing I had the whole building to myself. Everything was silent, that thick, heavy silence that settles over construction sites when all the noise stops. That's when I saw her for the first time. She was standing there, at the edge, just as they had said. She wore a white dress that swayed in the breeze, her long black hair covering her face. I couldn't make out her features, but something about her deeply unsettled me. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to move closer, but no matter how many steps I took, the distance between us never seemed to shrink. It was as if the building was stretching, as if she was trapped in a space that didn't obey the rules of the real world. Then, suddenly, the girl turned her head toward me. Even though I couldn't see her eyes, I felt her gaze pierce through me, digging into the deepest parts of my being. The air grew thick and a pressure tightened around my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, without warning, she let herself fall backward, straight into the abyss. I ran to the edge, but there was nothing there. No trace of her, just the whispering wind and the endless drop below. After that day, something in me changed. My co-workers noticed I was quieter, more anxious. Nights became a torment. I'd close my eyes and see her falling again and again. Even in my dreams, she appeared in dark corners, watching from the shadows. There was something about her that told me she wasn't just an illusion. She was real. I started asking around, trying to find answers. What I discovered only made me question my sanity even more. One of the workers, speaking in a hushed tone, told me that years ago, when the building was still in its early construction, Phases, a young girl, maybe 10 years old, had gone missing nearby. People said she had been seen playing among the steel beams, that no one ever saw her leave, that her body was never found. That's when the pieces started to fall into place. I realized she wasn't just a hallucination. She was a presence, trapped within the bricks and steel. The following days were a nightmare. Every time I went up to the top floor, she was there, always in the same spot, always at the same time. I no longer dared to approach. I would just stand there, frozen, watching as she repeated that eerie motion, falling again and again like a broken record. I never spoke about her to anyone. I didn't want them to think I had lost my mind, but her presence began to drain me. I felt exhausted, like something was slowly sucking the life out of me. One evening, as I was about to leave, the crane operator approached me. We had never spoken much before, but this time he looked straight into my eyes. like he knew exactly what was happening. He told me there was only one way to set her free. She needed a replacement. I didn't understand at first, but his expression was cold, calculating. There was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. I couldn't sleep that night, replaying his words in my head. A replacement? Was he suggesting that someone had to take her place for her to be released? How could I do something like that? Morality and fear battled inside me. I started avoiding the top floor, but her presence was like a fog spreading through the entire building. Even when I didn't see her, I could feel her. Finally, after days of mental torment, I decided I had to face her. I climbed to the top floor, knowing this time there was no turning back. I found her in the same spot, but something had changed. Her dress looked dirtier, her hair was more tangled. I stepped closer, and this time she didn't look at the sky. She looked at me. I felt my body freeze. An unnatural cold ran down my spine, and I knew something was wrong. She was pulling me in. Slowly but surely, I felt an invisible force pushing me toward the edge. I couldn't resist. It was like gravity itself had shifted, guiding me toward the abyss. I looked down and saw the endless drop. And in that moment, I understood. I saw her eyes, dark and lifeless, reflected in the glass of a nearby window. And I saw something else, a reflection of myself, falling again and again, like her. That's when I realized she didn't want me. She wanted me to join her, to share her fate. I don't remember how, but I managed to break free. I ran down the stairs without looking back, knowing that if I did, it might be the last thing I ever saw. That night, I left the building, and I never returned. My co-workers never saw me again. The project was completed, and the skyscraper became just another shadow in the New York City skyline, an imposing empty structure filled with secrets no one would dare to uncover. But I know she's still there, waiting, on the top floor, standing at the edge, searching for her next replacement. I've been working in construction for over 20 years. I've seen things that would make most people walk away from this job. I've witnessed horrific accidents, broken bones, blood-stained concrete, and I've heard stories about curse sites where workers refuse to return. But nothing I had ever experienced compared to what happened on that job near the hills of Blackridge. It was a night shift. Nothing unusual for projects where deadlines were tight. The building was supposed to be a massive shopping center, and the orders were clear. It had to be finished in 6 months, rain or shine. We had grown used to the midnight chill, to the thick mist that rolled down from the hills. But there was something about that place that never sat right with me. Something heavy, something dark, like an invisible weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. It was as if every brick, every steel beam held a secret. The first couple of nights passed without anything out of the ordinary, just the usual hum of machines and the constant buzz of the generator. But on the third night, around midnight, the silence was shattered by a scream. It wasn't human. It was a shriek that echoed through the steel beams, a sound so deep, so raw, it felt like it had risen from the very ground beneath us. Every man on site froze, shovels hanging in midair. A chill ran down my spine. We all exchanged glances, each of us silently asking if the others had heard it too. But no one said a word. The next morning, one of the masons, Luis, a strong, young guy, pulled me aside. He spoke in a hushed tone, like he was afraid something might hear. "They say about 50 years ago a worker was buried alive in these hills," he whispered. "They didn't find his body for weeks, and when they did, his face was twisted in terror." I dismissed it as just another ghost story. Every construction site had its share of myths, stories meant to scare the new guys. I had heard them all. But that night I heard the scream again, louder this time, closer, like it was rising from a deep pit. The sound was so piercing that I had to cover my ears. Some of the men dropped their tools and ran. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. Days passed, and the sight felt heavier, more oppressive. The workers were on edge. Some said they had nightmares of a man buried alive, his pale face covered in dirt, begging for his life. Even when I was awake, I started seeing things, dark shapes shifting at the edges of my vision. One night, while taking a short break, I glanced up at the unfinished structure. For a brief moment, I saw a figure standing at the top, a man, motionless, watching us. I blinked and he was gone. I told no one. I didn't want them to think I was losing my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. Then one night, the unthinkable happened. We were digging deep, laying the foundation, when one of the men screamed. I rushed to him, thinking he had hurt himself. But when I got there, I saw him trembling, pointing at the ground. I followed his gaze and saw it, a piece of cloth, old and tattered, buried in the dirt. The excavator dug a little deeper, and that's when we found it. A body, or at least what was left of it. The skull was crushed, the flesh long gone, leaving behind a mess of bones and decayed fabric. The site supervisor immediately halted all work and called the authorities. We stepped back, but I couldn't take my eyes off the remains. It was as if the empty sockets of that skull were staring right at me. The body was removed, and work was put on hold for a few days while the investigation took place. No one gave us any real explanation, but we all knew what it meant. We had found the buried man, the same one whose screams had been echoing through the site. When we returned to work, the air felt even heavier, as if the very ground resented our presence. More workers quit, and those who stayed spoke in whispers. About hearing footsteps when no one was there, about shadows moving just beyond their sight. I began dreaming of him, pale, trapped under layers of earth, his mouth open in a silent scream. And each night, in my dreams, he crept closer. I could feel his cold breath on my face. Then, one night, I stayed late at the site, going over blueprints. Before I realized it, midnight had come. I was about to leave when I heard it, a whisper, not a scream this time, a faint, barely audible murmur. It was coming from the foundations, from the very spot where we had found the body. Heart pounding, I stepped toward the edge of the pit. The whisper grew into a soft, agonized moan. It said my name. I leaned over, peering into the darkness. That's when I saw it, a hand rising from the dirt. I stumbled back, but before I could react, something icy clamped around my ankle. A force, cold, relentless, dragged me downward. I hit the ground hard, the soil shifting beneath me like it was swallowing me whole. I clawed at the edge of the trench, fighting against the pull. Whatever it was, it wanted me beneath the earth. With every ounce of strength, I managed to break free, scrambling away, gasping for air. That was the last night I set foot on that site. The next day I quit. I never heard the screams again, but the nightmares never left. Every night, the buried man appears, his dirt-covered face twisted in agony, his mouth stretched in a soundless wail. His hollow eyes stare at me, accusing, as if blaming me for disturbing his final rest. I don't know if what I saw was real or if it was just exhaustion and fear playing tricks on me. But even now, whenever I drive past the Blackridge Hills, I feel it. Something watching, something following. Like the buried man is still out there, still searching for vengeance. It was the year 2008, and my remodeling job had taken me to downtown Chicago. The building, a towering old structure standing among the newer skyscrapers, had a desolate aura. It felt cold, even though the sun burned hot over the streets. We had started work on the lower floors, tearing down walls and clearing debris to prepare for the installation of new finishes. Everything was going as expected, nothing out of the ordinary for a construction site, until we reached the third floor. That's when things started to feel different. At first, it was small things, tools that would go missing without explanation, objects shifting from where we had left them, and strange noises that seemed to come from nowhere. I chalked it up to fatigue, or maybe just the natural creaks of an old building. But one afternoon, while reviewing some blueprints with a co-worker, I heard something that sent chills down my spine. It was a whisper, a soft murmur, almost like someone praying or humming a melody. My co-worker and I exchanged glances, both aware that we were alone in that section of the building. The sound stopped just as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind a silence so heavy it was suffocating. A couple of days later, during demolition work, one of the laborers, Mike, mentioned seeing something strange. He had climbed onto the scaffold to adjust some metal sheets when, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a barefoot child running across the wooden planks as if playing. Startled and confused, he shouted to warn the boy, but within seconds the child had disappeared. He told me about it with a mix of disbelief and unease. I brushed it off, thinking it must have been a trick of the light or the dust playing with his vision. But then I saw him myself. It was late in the day, around 7 p.m., and the sun was beginning to set. We were in the final days of the project, finishing up details and installing the last of the finishes. I was alone checking some wooden panels that we were about to install. Suddenly, movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. When I looked up, there he was. A boy, no older than 8, with messy hair and bare feet. He stood there, staring directly at me with an expression that was a mix of sadness and curiosity. The air grew heavy, and a bone-chilling cold seeped into my body. Without thinking, I took a step toward him. But as soon as I moved, the boy turned and ran toward the edge of the scaffold, an area that led to nothing but open air. Terrified, I stumbled back, rushing inside the building, my breath ragged as if I had just escaped a nightmare. I told no one what I had seen. It sounded absurd, impossible even. But deep inside, I knew. What I had seen was real. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the barefoot child haunted my thoughts, refusing to let me rest. The next morning, determined to prove to myself that it had all been an illusion, I arrived earlier than usual. But as soon as I stepped into the building, I was met with something that made my blood run cold. There, on the dusty floor, leading to the edge of the scaffold, were footprints. Small, perfect imprints of bare feet, heading exactly where I had seen the boy vanish. Rumors began spreading among the workers. Curious neighbors, drawn by the construction, started gathering around, and soon stories of past tragedies surfaced. According to them, The building had been the site of a terrible accident decades ago. A young boy who once lived there had fallen from the third floor, right where we were working. The story claimed that he had died instantly and that ever since his spirit wandered the building, appearing occasionally to play among the debris and startle those who dared to disturb his home. That night I made a decision. I needed to find out the truth. The site supervisor allowed me to stay, though he did so with a skeptical smirk. I prepared a small lamp and settled into the darkness, ready to face whatever was lurking in that place. Every creak, every shifting shadow seemed alive. My breathing became heavier with every step, and the air smelled of dampness and old dust, as if the building itself resisted being renewed. Near midnight, I made my way back to the third floor. I turned on my lamp and carefully inspected every corner, searching for any sign, any indication of what we had all experienced. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps, the unmistakable sound of bare feet tapping against the scaffold. I turned slowly, and there he was again. This time, his expression was different. It wasn't just sadness, it was almost as if he was trying to tell me something. I stood frozen, unable to speak, as time seemed to slow around me. The boy raised a hand and pointed toward the interior of the building. A frigid chill ran down my spine. I understood. I had to follow him. I hesitated, but then stepped forward, trailing behind him into a small room we hadn't explored before. As I crossed the threshold, the boy vanished, but the air inside the room was thick, oppressive. There were no windows, and the only source of light was my lamp, flickering erratically. Then, on the floor, I saw something unexpected. A small shoe. An old, dust-covered child's shoe, unmistakably real. I picked it up with trembling hands, noticing how worn and torn it was, as if it had been there for decades. And then I looked up. Faintly visible under the dim light, something was scrawled on the wall. "Don't leave me alone." The message was written in childlike handwriting, each word filled with desperation. I bolted, dropping the shoe and the lamp. I ran down the stairs as fast as I could, feeling as if the walls were closing in around me. When I finally burst out onto the street, the cool night air hit me like a splash of cold water, pulling me back to reality. I took deep breaths, trying to calm myself. The next day, I didn't return to work. I resigned from the project without explanation. But even now, every time I pass by that building, I feel it, the weight of his gaze from one of the windows, waiting, trapped in a limbo from which he may never escape. And since that night, every time I hear about the renovation of an old building, I can't help but remember that night, that presence, and those haunting words written on the wall. I've never liked talking about this story, but after so many years, I've come to the conclusion that maybe sharing it will free me from its weight. I'm from Texas, and although I've worked in many remote places, I have never experienced anything like what I lived through on that construction site in the countryside. Maybe what I recount here is just my imagination running wild, or maybe it's something else, but this is the truth. Since then, I can't sleep without seeing his face. It all started when the company sent me to supervise a project in the outskirts, in the middle of nowhere. It was a small building, some sort of warehouse or storage unit. The land was vast, surrounded by tall grass and twisted trees that swayed as if hiding secrets. The atmosphere was heavy, the air felt thick, and even the birds, when they dared to pass, fell silent as they crossed the field. On the second day of excavation, one of the workers, Mike, hit something hard beneath the ground. The shovel struck. Something metallic with a dull thud that echoed in a strange way, as if expanding through the earth. He dug a little more, and there it was. A thick chain with rusted links that looked like they had been carved from ancient iron. It was clear. It had been there for a long time. Some links were so embedded in the ground that it seemed as if the soil had swallowed them. One of the workers joked that it looked like an old slave chain, something time had forgotten. However, none of us could say for sure. I examined it more closely, curious, and noticed that the chain had engravings, worn-out markings that, if you looked closely, seemed to depict human and animal figures twisted together in a grotesque dance. The worst part was that the longer you stared, the more it seemed like they moved, as if those carvings had a life of their own. That night, back at the makeshift camp we had set up near the site, I couldn't sleep. I felt a weight on my chest, as if something invisible was pressing down on me. When I finally managed to drift off, I had a nightmare. I saw a man covered in shadows, dragging that same chain across the ground, leaving deep grooves in the earth. His face was hidden, but somehow I knew he was looking at me. I woke up in a cold sweat, certain that I was not alone. I looked around. Nothing, just darkness and the whisper of the wind through the trees. The strange thing was that the next day I wasn't the only one. Several of the workers complained about having similar nightmares. They all spoke of a man, of chains, of a presence pressing down on their chests. It was as if a shadow had fallen over all of us without warning. No one wanted to talk too much about it. Somehow, we all preferred to pretend it was just a coincidence, a bad night caused by exhaustion. The construction continued, and with each passing day, the chain seemed less buried. On the first night after its discovery, someone had partially uncovered it. It seemed like a bad joke, but no one dared to admit it. However, by the third day, the chain was completely out of the ground, as if something had pulled it from below. It seemed impossible. The workers swore they hadn't touched it, and somehow I believed them. The chain didn't look like it had been dug up with tools. It seemed to have been freed by a force we couldn't comprehend. The nightmares didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Now, in my dreams, the man wasn't just looking at me. He was getting closer. I could hear the sound of the chain scraping against the ground, the metallic screech echoing in my mind even after I woke up. I didn't dare tell the others how much this was affecting me, but soon I realized I didn't need to. Fear had settled in each of us like an unwanted guest. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a shovel and headed to the spot where we had found the chain. My plan was to bury it again, to return it to oblivion. When I arrived, I realized someone else had the same idea. The chain was half buried, but not neatly. It looked as if someone had tried to cover it in a hurry, with the desperation of someone trying to rid themselves of something dangerous. Without thinking, I took the shovel and started digging furiously, trying to hide whatever was robbing us of our peace. But as I dug, something strange happened. The ground became soft, too soft. It was like digging into flesh instead of soil. A nauseating smell filled the air, a mix of rot and something sickly sweet that clung to my throat. And then, just a few inches deep, I found a bone. My breath caught in my chest. It wasn't an animal bone. It was a human tibia. I held it in my hands, trying to convince myself that this was all just a bad dream. But it wasn't. That's when I heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was the sound of heavy, erratic breathing coming from somewhere nearby. I felt eyes on me. My hands trembled so much that I dropped the shovel, and in the absolute silence, I heard it. the clanking of chains. A dull, deep sound shifting in. The shadows. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't think of anything other than getting away from that cursed place. The next morning, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I gathered my things and left before anyone could stop me. Some of my co-workers tried to ask what had happened, but my silence was enough for them to stop insisting. However, before I left, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. One of the workers, David, had disappeared during the night. No, one had seen him since he went to bed, and his cot was empty. No signs that he had left on his own. The authorities searched for him but found nothing. No footprints, no traces, nothing. It was as if the ground had swallowed him whole. Some of the workers mentioned that on his last night, David had talked about digging up the chain completely, about ending this horror once and for all. Others said they saw him walking into the mist alone, as if following an invisible trail. Years later, I returned to that area, driven by the need to confirm that it had all been just a bad dream, a trick of my mind. The warehouse was in ruins, abandoned. The vegetation had overtaken everything, and it looked as if time had frozen. I approached the spot where we had found the chain, and there it was, half buried, just like on the first day. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. A new series of markings had appeared on the links, markings that hadn't been there before. They were deeper, as if someone had carved them in desperation. Suddenly, a cold breeze surrounded me, and I felt the same weight as that first night. I turned on my heels and left, convinced that some things are better left undisturbed. Since then, every night when I close my eyes, I feel something pulling me. I hear the clanking of chains. I see a shadow coming closer, always closer. And, though I try to convince myself that it was all just exhaustion, deep down, I know the truth. There are things we cannot bury. Secrets that remain beneath the earth, waiting to be unearthed. My name is Frank, and I work as a night security guard at a construction site here in Chicago. I've been in this job for a couple of years now, always on the night shift, always watching over unfinished projects where the shadows blend with the concrete, and the echo of noises gets trapped between the steel beams. Nothing ever scared me, or at least that's what I thought until recently. It all started on a night when the silence was so thick you could almost touch it. The wind barely moved the leaves of the trees, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. The site I was guarding was a 15-story apartment tower. The structure was complete, but the interior was still unfinished. The walls were bare concrete, and the steel beams seemed to absorb every sound, as if the building itself was alive, breathing, waiting. That night, as I made my usual rounds, I heard a whistle. It was constant, drawn out, and growing more intense, with every step I took. At first I thought it was the wind slipping through some crack in the structure, but there was something off about it. It wasn't the usual sound of air whistling through gaps. It had a different tone, almost human, like a stretched-out, piercing lament. And the strangest thing, it felt too close, as if it was coming from right beside me. But every time I turned around, there was no one there. I didn't think too much of it at first. I figured it might be some poorly installed pipe or the sound of loose material shifting on the scaffolding. I continued my rounds, noting in my logbook the checkpoints I had to cover, but as I reached the 4th floor, the whistle grew even stronger, so strong it made my skin crawl. A feeling crept over me. I wasn't alone. That was when I remembered a story a co-worker had told me weeks before. According to him, a few years ago, during the construction of another high-rise nearby, a worker had fallen from the top floor. They said it was an accident, a slip caused by the rain, but some swore they had seen him jump. The strangest part. My co-worker said that ever since then, the night guards working alone in these buildings had reported hearing a whistle, a sharp, ghostly sound that floated through the beams and empty corridors. When I asked if he was joking, he just looked at me with those tired eyes, the kind only people who have seen too much have. And without a word, he crossed himself. I never believed in those stories. But that night, the whistle seemed alive. With every step I took, the sound followed, shifting in pitch, becoming almost a sinister melody. I picked up my pace, wanting to finish my patrol and get back to the guard station. But just as I reached the stairwell, I heard another sound. A dull, heavy thud, like something massive had hit the floor. My heart pounded wildly, the thudding in my chest sinking with the silence of the building like a drumbeat of terror. Slowly, I stepped toward the elevator shaft, peering inside. That's when I saw it. For just an instant, I swear, I saw a shadow plummet, so fast that I barely made out its shape. It was a body falling from above, vanishing into the abyss of darkness below. But there was no sound of impact, just a deep emptiness, swallowing. I swallowed hard. A coldness crept up my legs, crawling into my chest, as if something was paralyzing me from the inside. Then I heard it again. The whistle. But this time, it came from the top floor. And it had changed. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, a sensation creeping down the stairwell, slow but relentless. It felt as though something invisible was descending, step by step, closing the distance between us. My breath hitched. My body, despite the terror consuming me, refused to move. With every ounce of strength, I forced myself to break free, bolting down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, not daring to look back. The presence was behind me. I could feel it, just a breath away. I reached the guard station, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Outside, the site looked normal, as if nothing had happened, but inside the air was heavy, suffocating. I turned off the lights, trying to steady my breathing, but the echo of that whistle lingered, reverberating in my skull like a ghost clinging to my mind. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the sound disappeared, vanishing as suddenly as it had come. I didn't hear it again that night, but I couldn't shake it. The days that followed, the memory only grew stronger, as if that whistle had embedded itself in my soul. I started asking around, talking to other guards, trying to see if anyone had experienced the same thing. Most laughed, brushed me off as crazy, or tried to turn it into a joke. But one man, an older guard who had been doing this job for years, just stared at me with a solemn intensity. Then he told me something that sent ice through my veins. He said that over a year ago at this very site, a security guard had been found dead in the basement. No one knew how he had ended up there, but his body showed signs of a massive fall from a great height. Some believed he had jumped from one of the upper floors. Others swore he had been pushed. But the strangest part? The coroner's report. His body was shattered from the impact, but his hands were covered in fresh cement, as if he had tried to grab onto something that was never really there. Since that night, fear has been my shadow. Every patrol, every dark hallway, every whisper of the wind through the steel beams reminds me that I am not alone. Sometimes, as I walk through the empty corridors, I feel something behind me, a presence lurking just beyond my sight, a shadow shifting between the columns and scaffolding. And the whistle, it never really left. It returns on some nights when I'm alone, when the silence is so deep that even the smallest noise feels like a threat. I don't know if what I heard and saw was real or just a trick of my mind. But every night, when I finish my shift and leave the site, I feel it watching me, waiting. Like the building itself is alive, something made of concrete and steel, feeding on the fear of those who walk within its walls. I've thought about quitting, walking away from this job and finding something less unsettling, but the fear of that final night, that last shift where the whistle might be louder, where the shadow might come close enough to reach me, keeps me here, trapped. Because deep down, I know, if I run, it will follow, and once it finds you, it never lets go. Each night, the sight feels darker. The weight of the beams presses down on me as if they are waiting. And in the silence, as I move through the corridors of concrete, the whistle starts again, louder, closer, and I know next time I might not be lucky enough to escape. My name is Peter Gutierrez, and I come from a small mountain town in Colorado called Silver Ridge. I've been a construction worker my entire life. Ever since I can remember, my hands have shaped bricks and cement, and my eyes have witnessed buildings rise from their foundations to towering heights. However, what I have experienced in my career goes beyond what most people could ever imagine. What I'm about to share is a series of events that haunt me to this day. Experiences that reveal a darkness hidden beneath the foundations of many structures. This is my story, a tale of horror and tragedy. It all began about 15 years ago. Back then, I was young, strong, and eager to earn money to support my family. I took on any job offered to me without questioning too much. During that time, I received an offer to work on the construction of a luxury complex on the outskirts of the city. The pay was excellent, far better than anything I had earned before, and even though the location was a bit remote, I didn't hesitate to accept. Upon arriving at the construction site, I noticed something peculiar. There was an eerie silence. In the air, a kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The site was surrounded by dense forest, and much of the area was deserted, except for a few makeshift barracks for the workers. I met the foreman, a burly middle-aged man named Mr. Johnson. He had a stern look and barely spoke a word as he assigned me my tasks. The first few days seemed normal, at least on the surface. We worked long hours under the scorching sun, lifting walls and mixing cement. However, I began to notice that some workers seemed uneasy, always glancing over their shoulders and whispering among themselves. At night, while trying to sleep in my barrack, I heard strange noises in the forest, whispers, chants, and sometimes muffled screams that seemed to come from deep within the woods. One night, curiosity got the best of me. I decided to follow the sounds to see what was happening. I moved cautiously through the dense trees, careful not to be seen. The deeper I went, the louder the murmurs and chants became. Eventually, I reached a clearing where I saw a group of people gathered around a large bonfire. I recognized some of them as my co-workers, but there were also strangers dressed in dark robes. What I witnessed next was terrifying. In the center of the circle, there was a stone altar. Lying on it was a human body. I couldn't tell if they were alive or dead. The robed men chanted in a language I didn't recognize as Mr. Johnson, the foreman, raised a ceremonial knife. What happened next froze my blood. With a precise movement, Johnson plunged the knife into the man's chest. Blood spilled onto the altar, and the chanting grew louder. I stood there. I spent the night trembling in my bunk, waiting to hear Michael's fate, but there was only silence. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The construction progressed, and I remained in my place, waiting for the right moment. Then, one day, while working in the basement, I found a small notebook hidden behind a pile of bricks. Opening it, I discovered that it belonged to a former worker, someone who had also witnessed the horrors and had tried to document what was happening. The pages were filled with frantic notes, details of the rituals, names of those who had been sacrificed. The final entry was incomplete, ending abruptly as if the writer had been interrupted. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't stand by while more people were killed. One night, after an exhausting workday, I approached one of the younger workers, a boy named Jake, and told him what I had seen and read. Jake, though terrified, agreed to help me gather evidence and find a way to stop the sacrifices. For the next few weeks, we documented everything we could. We took photographs, wrote detailed notes, and began planning our escape. We knew we couldn't trust anyone else at the construction site. Any attempt to seek help could lead to our deaths. The only way out was to leave in the dead of night, when security was weakest. Finally, on a moonless night, Jake and I were ready to escape. With our backpacks filled with evidence, we ventured into the forest, following a hidden path we had discovered during our explorations. My heart pounded in my chest. Every sound in the darkness felt like an omen of our doom. We walked for hours, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and the place of horrors. Then, suddenly, we heard voices behind us. They had discovered our absence. Panic set in, and we started running. But the terrain was treacherous, and soon we found ourselves tangled in thick underbrush. The voices grew closer. They surrounded us. Mr. Johnson stepped out from the shadows, a cruel smile on his face. "You thought you could escape?" he said, advancing with the ceremonial knife in hand. Jake tried to fight back, but it was useless. I watched as he collapsed to the ground, motionless. I stood before Johnson, knowing my fate was sealed. "What we're doing is necessary," Johnson said, his eyes gleaming with uncontrollable madness. "These sacrifices ensure the durability of our structures. It's an ancient practice, a secret that few understand." I felt the cold blade against my skin. I closed my eyes, accepting my end. But then, a loud noise shattered the silence. A group of armed men burst through the trees, shouting orders and firing into the air. They were the police, alerted by an anonymous tip. Someone had found our notes and photographs. In the chaos that followed, I was rescued. Johnson and his accomplices were arrested, and the construction was halted indefinitely. The evidence we had gathered was enough to convict them, and the stories of the human sacrifices became a national scandal. Justice was served, but the nightmares never left me. Even now, I still see their faces, the victims, the rituals, the helplessness. They haunt me. In some way, I feel responsible for not acting sooner, but I also know I survived to tell this story, to warn others about the horrors that might be hidden beneath any building. Today, I still work in construction, but every time I start a new project, I can't help but wonder what dark secrets might be buried in its foundations. And every night when I close my eyes, the images of those sacrifices return, reminding me that true horror doesn't always come from the supernatural. It comes I am still a construction worker to this day, but every time I start a new project, I can't help but wonder what dark secrets might be hidden in the foundations. And every night, when I close my eyes, the images of those sacrifices come back to me, reminding me that true horror is not always in the supernatural, but in what humans are capable of doing in the name of ambition and superstition. My name is Peter Gutierrez, and this is my story. Let it serve as a warning to all those who venture into the world of construction. There are secrets better left undiscovered, and horrors better left unseen. Then one day, while working in the basement, I found a small notebook hidden behind a pile of bricks. Opening it, I discovered that it belonged to a former worker, someone who had also witnessed the horrors and had tried to document what was happening. The pages were filled with frantic notes, details of the rituals, names of those who had been sacrificed. The final entry was incomplete, ending abruptly as if the writer had been interrupted. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't stand, while more people were killed. One night, after an exhausting workday, I approached one of the younger workers, a boy named Jake, and told him what I had seen and read. Jake, though terrified, agreed to help me gather evidence and find a way to stop the sacrifices. For the next few weeks, we documented everything we could. We took photographs, wrote detailed notes, and began planning our escape. We knew we couldn't trust anyone else at the construction site. Any attempt to seek help could lead to our deaths. The only way out was to leave in the dead of night when security was weakest. Finally, on a moonless night, Jake and I were ready to escape. With our backpacks filled with evidence, we ventured into the forest, following a hidden path we had discovered during our explorations. My heart pounded in my chest. Every sound in the darkness felt like an omen of our doom. We walked for hours, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and the place of horrors. Then, suddenly, we heard voices behind us. They had discovered our absence. Panic set in, and we started running. But the terrain was treacherous, and soon we found ourselves tangled in thick underbrush. The voices grew closer. They surrounded us. Mr. Johnson stepped out from the shadows, a cruel smile on his face. "You thought you could escape," he said, advancing with the ceremonial knife in hand. Jake tried to fight back, but it was useless. I watched as he collapsed to the ground, motionless. I stood before Johnson, knowing my fate was sealed. "What we're doing is necessary," Johnson said, his eyes gleaming with uncontrollable madness. "These sacrifices ensure the durability of our structures. It's an ancient practice, a secret that few understand." I felt the cold blade against my skin. I closed my eyes, accepting my end. But then, a loud noise shattered the silence. A group of armed men burst through the trees, shouting orders and firing into the air. They were the police, alerted by an anonymous tip. Someone had found our notes and photographs. In the chaos that followed, I was rescued. Johnson and his accomplices were arrested, and the construction was halted indefinitely. The evidence we had gathered was enough to convict them, and the stories of the human sacrifices became a national scandal. Justice was served, but the nightmares never left me. Even now I still see their faces, the victims, the rituals, the helplessness. They haunt me. In some way, I feel responsible for not acting sooner. But I also know I survived to tell this story, to warn others about the horrors that might be hidden beneath any building. Today, I still work in construction, but every time I start a new project, I can't help but wonder what dark secrets might be buried in its foundations. And every night when I close my eyes, the images of those sacrifices return, reminding me that true horror doesn't always come from the supernatural. It comes from what humans are willing to do in the name of ambition and superstition. I am Peter Gutierrez, and this is my story. A warning to anyone who dares enter the world of construction. There are secrets best left undiscovered, and horrors best left unseen. I'm still a construction worker to this day, but every time I start a new project, I can't help but wonder what dark secrets might be hidden in the foundations. And every night, when I close my eyes, the images of those sacrifices come back, to me reminding me that true horror is not always in the supernatural, but in what humans are capable of doing in the name of ambition and superstition. My name is Peter Gutierrez, and this is my story. Let it serve as a warning to all those who venture into the world of construction. There are secrets better left undiscovered and horrors better left unseen.